Hello, beautiful community. We're going to talk about the prospects of a future conflict between Russia and NATO. I'm going to do that by looking at a video that Anders Nielsen released, and Anders needs no introduction in this community, on this topic. I'm going to attach Anders' video below. I'm also going to stick it at the end, somewhere here or here, at the end of this brief chat. And I want to simply express support for what Anders has said, but then also add, I think, 3 political footnotes that help us make sense not just of my interpretation of what's going on in the Kremlin, but of what the debate is about in political terms when you see experts out there disagreeing about whether Russia-NATO conflict is a real danger or whether it's something that's unlikely and we shouldn't excessively over-worry ourselves. So let's look at what Anders says and then jump to 3 footnotes that I think are very significant. Of course, there are so many comments about which say, what war with NATO are you talking about? Putin can't even win in Ukraine. And anybody who discusses these issues on this platform or other platforms in the media knows that that's a very, very common view you run into dozens of times a day. And I have direct message inboxes, email inboxes that are stuffed with exactly that message. And I get it a lot on YouTube too. And Anders says, look, the problem with that idea is that it contains 2 errors. The first error is that we're not talking about a war between Russia and NATO in its current form, a war between Russia and NATO as a whole, all of NATO. And the second error is that we're not talking about a territorial war. What we're rather talking about is Russia trying to trigger Article 5 in a way that will not lead to a NATO response and to a US response in particular. Russia doesn't want a war with NATO. Russia wants NATO to fail to respond to a provocation and thereby make itself essentially redundant. So that's the picture we're talking about. And Anders proposes hypothetically that some place in remote Finland might be a candidate for such a provocation, and that might be more likely, Anders thinks, than the Baltics, because the Kremlin would want to keep a sufficient degree of escalation management and try to not create a situation that would get out of control. So what Russia wants with its war with NATO is precisely for there not to be a war with NATO, for NATO not to respond, and for that to trigger, or if you like, put the final nail in the coffin of NATO's decline. 3 footnotes that I want to add. First, putting crucial military factors aside, what's this debate about when experts disagree about how worried we should be about the conflict between Russia and NATO later on in this decade? Politically, what this disagreement is primarily about is the question of how constitutively linked war and regime security are for the Kremlin. That doesn't mean how much Putin wants more war. It means how much Putin is co-opted into more war in a way that he can no longer control. Right? So this is not just a conception that's in the head of one person or in the heads of several people. It's something that already has policy and economic and institutional percolation. And we're really talking about a situation in which Putin thinks that desisting from war, desisting from escalation is simply not an option as far as his regime security is concerned. So is this going to be the case? How closely is regime security, as they are bound to see it in the Kremlin, linked with the perpetuation of war, the perpetuation of foreign escalation? So it's crucial to understand how central that issue is to disagreement between experts. Now, it's secondary, right, whether you adopt my view on this or not. What I want you to do is to think about this better for yourself. But of course, if you're after a recommendation, my recommendation is, unfortunately, that link is pretty constitutively tight. Second thing that I think is really important to understand is that if you paint a picture of the Kremlin worldview, one of the top 10 and maybe even top 5 elements of it would be a certain kind of almost theological conviction about the irreversible decline of the West. And I call it a kind of Fukuyamianism in reverse, because it helps us understand how anchored it is and how detached it is from empirical evidence. So think of how attached we used to be to the idea that certain kinds of free market, certain kinds of economic policy leads to democratization. Think of how striking the evidence against this was empirically, but how deeply we continued to believe in it. To some extent, we actually still do. So there's a kind of conviction there in the Kremlin that is about our decline. It's a conviction about our decline in domestic politics, right? So we're talking about democratic decline. We're talking about our failure, right? Our inevitable forthcoming failure to sustain our democratic institutions. And the weaker we are at home, the less trust we have at home, the worse our counter-majoritarian institutions function, the more inept we're going to be at doing anything constructive on the international stage. Now, you've got to keep two things apart here, though, at this point. One is that we're really experiencing democratic decline, and we're really experiencing a democratic decline mediated incapacity to come up with a strategy for arrangements on the international scene. But don't confuse that with Putin's much less empirical and much more fantastic and exaggerated, right, attribution of this challenge to us. Relative to the reality. The reality is problematic enough, but that's not how Putin sees it. Putin sees it as being much more dramatic, much more inexorable, much more imminent. Increasingly, the West will be a sort of thing that once you prod it, it will fall apart. Nearly everybody who has political power in Russia, has influence on political power, shares this Fukuyamianism in reverse. And this is of crucial importance to any conversation about a future conflict between NATO and Russia in ways that are obvious that I don't need to explicate now. Will this happen? Well, the last video on my main channel is about this, and in it I say that on balance, if I were to gamble, I'll say we'll get away with it. Not because we aren't trending in the direction of that kind of conflict, at least as far as this story about, war and regime security is concerned for the Kremlin, but because there are plenty of historical contingencies that might intervene in between. So we're likely to, and of course saying likely here is an irrelevance, it's not coherent, we're in the realm of uncertainty. But for everyday purposes, we can say we're probably likely to slide past this one, but the risk is very significant, and there are plenty of trends that are pointing in that direction. So my message is we're trending there, but we might get away with it, probably will get away with it. Interestingly, that's what I said in that video in the main channel, and I've had so many bits of correspondence saying, how can you definitely know that there will 100% be a conflict between Russia and NATO? Well, I actually said in the video that if anything, we'll probably get away with it. But it's important to pay attention to our incapacity to read, to listen, to interpret, as we engage with all of these issues. Because that can affect all of us. Now, my third point. There's a kind of a tension between two things going on in the Kremlin. One is a sense of Russia's borderlessness. And, there's a placard in Moscow now that you can see, which says, Russia has no borders, with a picture of Putin there. But at the same time, there's also a very strong conception in the Kremlin of this is ours and this is not ours. So how do you square the two? Well, I think you square the two, first of all, by pointing out that various kinds of thinking something and not thinking it are eminently possible and a big part of political life. But you also square it by pointing out that Russia's borderlessness stops, or at least becomes very, very weak once you get beyond Eastern Europe. So there's a kind of a proprietorial attitude to Eastern Europe, virtually all of it, up until East Germany. And then that runs out. And I don't think that has an effect on Anders's comment about Finland being a good candidate versus the Baltics, except just in the sense that I don't think the Russians see Finland as theirs, but they certainly see the Baltics as theirs. And what that means is that it's possible for them to think, and indeed they do think, that if something that is theirs and doesn't belong to the West is prodded, the West ain't gonna stand up and defend it. You don't defend when things get existential, something that isn't really, really yours. Yes, you might go on for years as though it were yours, but when you're really tested, especially if you've got this decline, democratic decline at home, you're gonna concede the point that this just wasn't yours to begin with, and you're going to let it go. So that's a very important distinction, I think, that does still work in the Kremlin despite this borderlessness. And so I think that's worth bearing in mind as a political consideration that may or may not affect the conversation of where we might see such a conflict if it occurs, right? So I'm staying completely away from saying anything that requires military expertise. I suppose one final remark is that the Russians feel that the Americans really, really understand that Ukraine is definitely not theirs and that it is Russian. that's what the Kremlin think, and I'm deliberately exaggerating this to generate empathy in us. And they think that the very reason the United States have got involved in Ukraine is because they know that it isn't theirs and are simply engaged in Ukraine, using Ukraine as a means of overthrowing the Putin regime. And I'm going to again be provocative here to trigger empathy and ending Putin's life. It's very significant that that's the connection and how it works. Enough. Anders' video will be here, and we'll talk very soon. On my main channel, I now contracted my notes on the breakup of Russia as a question, as an issue, to 19 pages. Once it gets down to about 10 or 12, I think I'll be ready to deliver the message to all of you. Hopefully very, very soon. Lots of love. Talk soon.